Why do certain musty or animalistic aromas like barnyard or manure become more acceptable to wine lovers over time? What does minerality really mean when it comes to wine? Is it a taste? Is it a texture? What the heck is it? Why is mouthfeel so important to appreciating wine? And how does the color of wine influence our perception of how it tastes? In today's episode, you'll hear the stories and tips that answer those questions in part 2 of our chat with Gus Zhu. You don't need to have listened to part 1 from last week first, but if you missed it, go back and have a listen after you finish this one. By the end of our conversation, you'll also discover what's behind the perception of saltiness and minerality in wine, why we've developed more complex perceptions of bitterness and how it influences our experience of tannins in wine, how we misunderstand sweetness when it comes to wine, what are the most interesting aspects of oak aging wine and why there is so much diversity in it, and why it's important to embrace sensory differences in wine tasting. All right, let's dive in. Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my 3rd book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 308. 2 of you are going to win a copy of Gus's terrific new book, Behind the Glass, The Chemical and Sensorial Terroir of Wine Tasting. These are fascinating concepts. You'll love the book. All you have to do is email me and let me know that you'd like to win. I'll choose 2 people randomly from those who contact me. If you haven't won a book yet, now is your chance. And keep listening, as my goal is to offer lots more books and other prizes with every episode. Makes me feel like Oprah. I'll announce more winners next week. Just email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com. In other book news, if you're reading the paperback or ebook of Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much, or listening to the audiobook, I'd love to hear from you. Again, at natalie@nataliemclean.com. I'll put a link in the show notes to all retailers worldwide at nataliemclean.com/308. Okay, on with the show. So why do certain aromas like musty or animalistic ones become more acceptable to wine lovers over time? Is that even the barnyard, the so-called euphemistic name sometimes for manure or whatever in Burgundy or whatever? Do we just accommodate, or is our sense of taste or smell becoming more evolved that we grow to like these? Are we just accommodating to them, or what's going on there?
Okay, so this could be a bit personal, and this is nothing scientific. To me, I just think that certain weird smells, especially in certain natural wines, right, which seems to be popular nowadays, honestly, to myself and to some people around me, certain weird smells like barnyard, those kind of smells, we cannot accept. So I have a feeling is that it is the wine industry or the media try to promote certain style of wines like natural wines that they make people believe that quite a lot of people love those kind of smell and taste. But
Yeah,
I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, no.
I'm not sure about that. And the one thing that is related to my book is that certain smells, if you in natural wines, let's say I have a glass, not a natural wine, but in this glass, there are some weird smells associated with compounds like isovaleric acid. You don't have to remember the term, but certain type of smell or certain type of compound, right?
Does that translate to something? Isovaleric acid? Is that like manure? What is that?
Well, stinky smell in general.
Stinky,
there are
okay.
so many different types of stinky smell. And also sweaty, or some people say some really bad cheesy smell. And some other compounds also are responsible for it, but let's not dig into that. But more importantly, those kind of compounds, certain people are very sensitive to it. Certain people are not. So when you taste certain natural wines to certain people, overall, they smell those kind of wines as less stinky as compared to you. So we need to be aware of that. If they love certain smell, it's either they got used to it, they started to appreciate that, or it is simply because they do not find them that stinky.
Wow. Yeah. I can't imagine a dinner party. Here's the stinky wine you love. Would you like some more of it?
Well, it's a stinky one that I found stinky, but you don't find
You don't,
stinky. That
yes.
is hence you like it.
Absolutely. Again, your cultural assumptions, your genetics, everything sets the stage for this. So you've explored both sourness and saltiness when it comes to wine tasting, two overlooked aspects often. How do these interact? How do they play a part? Like, I personally find it hard to differentiate in wine between a so-called salty taste versus acidity versus the even more vague concept of minerality. And maybe we're referring to very similar sensations or tastes, but let's talk about saltiness first. What is it when it comes to wine?
So, if you talk about pure saltiness, just the salt as we eat every day, right? That is sodium. Okay, so that's sodium chloride, and they do exist in certain wines. It's just chemical analysis, people do not analyze them. There are certain things by law people need to analyze, like alcohol, you have to analyze before you can label and ship and sell the bottle. But salt, people never analyze them. But to me, actually, this is something I will do in the future, is that I would analyze salt in certain wines because people ignore that part. And like a bit of salt in food can greatly change the taste. So I think in certain wines, that tiny amount of salt can change the taste. So that's my personal project. Shh.
That's a great project. Are there certain wines that generally tend to have a saltier character than other wines, or regions, or grapes?
Yeah, that is a thing that we cannot say for sure. So in the book, I did mention that I believe certain wines, like in sherry region, where they even let wind blowing from the ocean into the cellar, they could induce some salt into the maturation barrels. And also, just based on my classmates' feedback, I have a Greek classmate, they have some outdoor fermenters for their wines in Santorini Island. And they say, okay, if every day after a few hours, if you just touch the outside jacket of the fermenter, right, fermentation tank, it's an obvious layer of salt. You just touch it and there's salt in your hand. And there are some other things I cannot say because it's kind of like a winemaking secret that winemakers can kill me. But you could introduce
There are protection programs you can.
yeah.
Anyway,
You
okay.
you
Some
could
adjustments they're making. All right.
yeah, no, they are not adding salt deliberately, but they could introduce a tiny bit of sodium through certain winemaking processes. So anyway, I got gone too far on that, but just purely for salt, that is something that could exist in very small volumes in certain wines, and I personally do believe they could change the taste of wine. Having said that, when you refer to all the others, such as acid, minerality, those kind of feelings, those I cannot explain how to say by mixing them together because minerality and those kind of sensations are such vague terms and vague concepts that people talk about. So I can only explain, as in the book, in isolation. And I did say when people say minerality, people may refer to many, many different things to themselves. So that is why minerality, the term, is so difficult to translate in the industry because people are referring to different things for minerality. But having said that, my sensory professor said one thing. I want to quote hers because I think it's pretty true for the commercial world, is that people tend to be like, whenever they don't know how to describe certain taste or feeling, they use the term mineral.
I love it. I love it. The emperor has no clothes. I find that when I'm tasting and someone says minerality, I immediately think, well, this wine has lots of acidity, but I don't know what you're referring to. Do you think, or maybe you just don't even want to define it? To me, minerality should be more of a texture or a feeling than a taste. Like I'm not tasting minerals, so minerality, I don't know. I think of that Lickamade. I don't know if you grew up in China, so I don't know if you had it there, but there was this candy that bubbled on your tongue. And to me, that's the closest thing I can think of that like might be minerality, sort of a vibrancy, whatever. I'm not even sure.
As you mentioned, it really also depends on people's background, right? To me, my reference point for mineral are two things. One is that kind of cold spring water, because they came from the mountain, right, from the cave, and it gave me the feeling. But to my feeling is always the temperature. Whenever I drink something cold, I feel that kind of minerality. The other thing is the smell. So certain people do think certain smells reminds them of some minerals or earth or whatever rock. To me, yes, I can sort of understand that. So for certain smell, if you related that to gunflint or those kind of burnt matches, or those kind of things, right?
Sulfury, yeah.
Yeah, sulfury type of things. People refer that to mineral, which is also understandable if you have related experience.
Right. Wow. Okay. Now, the book also touches on the complexities of sweetness perception. How do we misunderstand sweetness when it comes to wine? I mean, first of all, people usually say, well, if you like sweet wine, you're just not that evolved. But I really dislike that because I think some of the most complex wines in the world have a good amount of sweetness, including German Riesling and the ranges of German Riesling. What's your take on sweetness and wine?
That's something like, even though this is more like a technical book, which I hope is not too technical, but it does have quite a few content that I want to introduce to people in terms of all the other things related to wine, like history, like culture. They do influence our perception to certain tastes. Like sweetness, the sweet taste genetically by itself is not that complex. It's not as complex as bitter because we have more genetics, genes responsible for different compounds for bitterness. Anyway, but for sweetness, it's more of a cultural thing, right? So people say they do not drink sweet, while some people still drink sweet and eat sweet stuff.
Talk sweet, drink dry. What is it? Talk sweet, drink dry. Yeah.
Talk
no,
dry,
no,
drink
it's
sweet.
the other way. Yes, exactly. There we go.
Like, oh, yeah.
Yes.
So it's very cultural. But I just want people to be aware of the fact that lots of the very, very classic wines, they are sweet wines. And this is easy to understand because wine came from Europeans, right? The wine culture basically come from European countries. And in European countries, they didn't have abundant resources of sugar, like beet or sugarcane, those kind of things, to industrialize sugar production in the past. So grapes are one of the most important gold for getting sugars, energies from. So people respect sweet wines and those kind of, raisin or botrytis wines more simply because sugar was precious in the past. And people do not want to admit they like to eat and drink sweet simply because Coca-Cola is a cheap product and it's everywhere nowadays, right?
Sure, and junk food, the sweetness of junk
food, yeah.
Yeah. But to your point, like the highest ranking of all Bordeaux, as you know, Chateau Yquem, above even Chateau Lafite and Margaux and all the rest of them, right at the top of the pyramid in the 1855 classification. I mean, that's a sweet dessert wine from Sauternes.
Exactly. So I always quiz people on two fun facts for the wine world, right? One is, as you just said, Chateau d'Yquem. So I ask people which one has the highest classification status in the world, and people may say Chateau Lafite or some others. No, it's Chateau d'Yquem. It's even superior than the first growth. The second fun question I ask people is that what is the longest living highest price wine in the world?
It's got to be a sweet wine.
it used to be the Egon Müller's TBA for the longest time. Nowadays,
really
it's
sweet
not
German wine. Okay.
exactly. Yep. Nowadays, it's not because Domaine de la Romanée County became number one. But
Wow,
if you
for
think
Pinot.
about for Burgundy, right? It's all the Burgundy fashion nowadays. But if you think about like which one lives the longest as the top price wine in history, that is the sweet German wine.
Right. Sugar's a preservative, as is tannin, alcohol, and so on. But then you mentioned TBA, and for those who may not be familiar, Trockenbeere Nachlese, thank you for giving me a chance to say that. I got to say it quickly before I muck it up. But yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense that would be a preservative. So that's sweetness. And what about bitterness? You said it's more complex. How does that relate? What do you cover in your book as it relates to bitterness and wine?
So because evolution-wise, animals, humans, we need to be sensitive to bitterness in order to test if this things, the plant or whatever we eat, is poisonous or not before we have a chance to swallow or we decide to spit them out, right? Otherwise, if you swallow, we can still sort of get it out, but it's much harder. So it's a defense system. But it's not a singular compound that can be poisonous. So if you think about how animals survive, they have to be sensitive to a wide range of compounds that could taste unpleasant, like bitter, and then they recognize it's poisonous. But throughout evolution, especially for human beings, nowadays we just need to read the instructions and rely on food safety programs to just say, okay, this is all safe to drink, safe to eat. So we don't need to rely on the taste, or in sometimes it's a sense of smell, right? To judge if this thing is good or not. So some of the genes we got lost, but we do need quite a wide range of genes to detect different compounds as bitter.
And then in bitterness, like we still talk about, even though we just dispelled the myth of the tongue map, but we still talk about a bitter finish. So is that really not happening, or it's just that's that last perception before we swallow? And because the taste buds have the capacity for all tastes, not just bitter, but we're just getting it strongly at the back for some reason?
That needs a bit more research, but my personal understanding is that, especially for, let's say, red wines and in certain white wines, the tannins could feel bitter to certain people. So when you put the wine on your palate, there are so many other things like fruitiness and sour and all those kind of alcohol, everything that mask those kind of tiny bit bitter sensation. But after you swallow or after you spit out, the residuals, you can start to see that bitterness from certain phenolics like tannins. That is what people generally agree. It is those kind of residual tannins and phenolics that gives the bitter taste. But I think this field needs more study.
I'm getting that as the end of a lot of questions here, but that's good. It shows just how much needs to be done. So tannins, that sort of furry mouth feeling we get when we drink oversteeped tea or eat walnuts or drink tannic wine, I mean, it can give us the perception of bitterness, but do tannins themselves have a taste, or are they just astringency, a tightness, like a textural thing?
Those are what we call the tactile sensations. Those are textural thing, mouthfeel thing, right? So other than the 5 or 6 basic tastes, we also have different feelings toward those kind of tactile, textual things. And that is almost like our skin. Our hand touch this, we feel it's hot or cold. We can position certain things. But for the mouth, right, for our tongue and all over our mouth, the trigeminal nerve will sense those kind of sensations. So we can feel the burn from chili peppers. We can probably feel burn from alcohol for certain people. And we can also feel like in China, we have a special pepper called the Sichuan peppercorn. And the Sichuan peppercorn makes you feel numb. So there's also a numbing sensation from certain food. So it's all interesting. And that is why people eat them and drink them, because it gives us a multiple different sensations that makes us exciting, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. The diversity of taste and texture. So tannins technically don't have a taste. Is that correct?
No, but wine is always a combination of all sorts of taste and smell and everything. So it's hard to isolate. If you can isolate tannin and just taste it, you will feel that it is only a tactile sensation. But rarely any food or drink has tannin in isolation. Well, probably we can go back to the real traditional tannin industry because the word tannin came from like tanning the animal parts and to make the leather, right? So if they extract those kind of plant-based tannins to do that and we just taste it, maybe it has less of the aromas but more of the pure taste of tannins.
We have a lot of weird homework coming off this episode, so to taste and smell.
Yeah.
But I get what you're saying. Everything's a combination. Therefore, you start getting tasting notes like dusty tannins. So, okay, but I see where they're coming from. Why is mouthfeel so important? Is it because it just adds to that sort of, you've got the flavors, you've got the aromas, and then you've got the textural element of the mouthfeel? Is there anything else you want to say about mouthfeel?
It's very simple as we discussed. It just add several other dimensions to your taste, which makes wine tasting even more interesting. But the other thing I would say is that nowadays, lots of people love to play the game of blind tasting, guessing the grape varieties, guessing the vintages, even guessing the regions without knowing what the wine is in the glass. But I would say some people rely on smell heavily just by smelling in front of the glass. But I would always encourage people to pay attention on the palate because lots of the clues for you to play that blind tasting game came from the aroma and the taste and the tactile sensations from the wine. So get everything from the wine, not just smelling the wine.
Yeah, and I always say to my online students, full-bodied feels like, doesn't taste like, but feels like cream. Medium-bodied, homogenized milk, 3%, and then light-bodied skim milk. Because you've got to get a sort of weighted feeling when we talk about mouthfeel, I think.
Those are good references.
Cool. What do you mean when you talk about flavor scalping?
Some people say some of the flavors were kind of mute or not that obvious, but it was supposed to be more pronounced. And those are not necessarily flavors. And in the book, I really pay attention to separating flavors from aromas. Because when some people say flavors, it's just the aromas. But when some people say flavors, it's a combination of everything they taste, including the taste on the tongue. So it's more about the aroma themselves that is kind of mute due to many different reasons. It could be that simply the winemaking is not that good, or it could be there are some other things such as cork taint, the TCA, those kind of compounds that actually attack our nose and make us not able to smell other aromas. So when a wine is tainted by cork taint, people say, oh, it is the cork taint that destroy those aroma compounds. No, the aroma compounds are there, but it actually destroy our nose temporarily so that we cannot perceive lots of the aromas hidden behind.
Okay, that's fascinating. I never knew that. Now, you write a lot about color. It's one of the things that we perhaps minimize in the wine world when it comes to wine tasting. We kind of say, okay, that's pale yellow, that's dark red, whatever, ruby. How does color affect our perception of wine, especially as it relates to how we perceive its taste?
Color is, first of all, easy. It's the easiest thing. So people usually look at the color first, right? Because it's kind of straightforward, even though we could see color a bit differently from each other, but it's easy as compared to smell or taste. But there's one thing that is very important to understand is that we are visual animals. We are visual beings. So we have preconceptions. We use our sight to prejudge a lot of things, which is nothing, there's nothing wrong with that. We always have these kind of things. Even though we want to be objective, we cannot.
But we're busy sorting things. Like there's just so much information in our environment. We got to handle it some way.
Exactly. So when we look at wine, I would say we could be even more biased
Mm-hmm.
when we see things first. For example, there are already studies shown that if you, well, I also have a white wine here, right? If
Okay.
you color the white wine as the red wine color and you ask people to smell it, they came up with all these descriptors that are related to red wines rather than the so-called white wine descriptors.
Right, like
So
the
it's,
red wine or the red fruits instead of the sort of peach, apricot, apple kind of white wine
yeah,
descriptors. Yeah.
exactly. And
Huh.
also the M&M, right? Chocolate little
Oh,
things.
yeah, yeah, M&Ms,
Yeah,
yeah.
M&M, and they did studies on M&M, right? They are all the same flavors, but
Oh,
if
oh
you,
no. I eat the
yeah,
red ones first for no reason. Wow.
right?
I don't,
And you would assume, especially for kids, you would assume that they have a preference towards things because they have preference towards the color. And if even they ask certain adults who are not familiar with the product to do experimentations on, they would assume the yellow ones would have more lemon flavor versus those kind of chocolatey ones would have more chocolate flavor. No, they are all the same flavor.
oh my gosh, another big myth busted here. And there's certain movie stars who require only certain color M&Ms be in their, movie trailer on set. Well, they're just creating a lot of nothing work for their
No, 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 they're
aides.
all relevant. We are living in the visual world. So like I always embrace my preconception on things because I see that thing first. And I don't do anything to just deliberately go against that. It's how we naturally behave, right?
Yeah. That's true. I just like to be judgy when it comes to movie stars, but that's something different.
Of course.
Um, so if you were colorblind, say you couldn't perceive the red-green colorblind attribute, how would that change the way you experience wine? Does it?
I would say there's nothing you can do if you're really colorblind. For example, certain people are not crazily colorblind. They may have difficulties judging from red to green, but they can see a difference. But certain people, unfortunately, a very tiny amount of the population, they really cannot see lots of colors. It's kind of rare, but you shouldn't feel so sad because you can enjoy the sense of smell, you can enjoy the sense of taste. You don't have to say this white wine has to be like a lemony or this red wine has to be some like purple-ish color. You don't have to because most of the time we put the wine in our mouth, we enjoy the liquid,
Mm-hmm.
right? So
That's true.
don't worry too much. And again, there's nothing you can do if it is something deeply genetic. For example, I didn't mention in my book because I cannot just put that photo in my book due to copyright issues. But if you think about it, many years ago, there's a huge social media thing on a dress. Some people look at it as white and gold, and some people look at black and blue. And people were debating, people were even fighting among families. I'm like, unless you have a technology to just change your genetic immediately now, you will still see the color as you see. It's genetic. It's not because you think in a weird way, right?
Wow. Yeah, I do remember there's a huge uproar on that. People calling other people crazy that they couldn't see clearly this is a white dress. I mean, what's wrong with you?
Yeah, and now science explained, right? Not fully explained, but it explained that certain. So I'll try to explain in a very simple term. Certain genetics will give your expression of the proteins in the eyes differently. So certain people at certain position in the eye will express certain proteins. Some other people will express another type of protein. So they're hugely different. That will influence the way we see certain colors. So because of the expression of different proteins, we will see certain people see more sensitive to red light as compared to certain people will be more sensitive to green light. So with all these kind of combinations, people will see that dress differently.
I love it. That's great. That's going to settle an argument once and for all at this Thanksgiving this year. I can't wait to bring it up again. Um, now, your book delves into oak aging, and you're quite a specialist on this, the chemistry of oak aging. Maybe talk about what is the most interesting aspect of oak aging for you, We'll get to a couple other things as well.
For oak, I just mentioned something in the book because now I understand more about oak. Oak is worth another book to write
Yes,
about.
it's a big
But
topic. Yeah.
yeah, but basically, what I want to say is that there are differences in oak. Just like in wine, there are just so many different factors that contribute to the differences. For example, different oak varieties, species, different forests, different growing environment, they can hugely change the flavors of oak. And also, when people make oak, they use different toasting levels using different ways of controlling the temperatures, and those will change the flavors a lot. So I would say if a winemaker or as a wine consumer, we taste wine with oak or we marry wine with oak, it is almost like getting to a relationship or getting to marriage where there are hundreds of people you could choose from. But how do I say this? Okay, let's just say boys and girls. Okay, there are hundreds of girls out there are hundreds of boys out there, and you try to find the perfect match, right? But it doesn't mean that it has to be this girl or this boy. There are just so many different options. So we have so many different grape varieties and from different growing environments. We also have different oak species from different terroir. So there's just so many options out there. I want the people to be aware of.
Yeah, it just gets really confusing, right? Just, but wonderfully diverse. I mean, that's the point of it. What is the Maillard reaction when it comes to oak toasting? You just talked about oak toasting there.
Yeah, so Maillard reaction in simple terms is actually sugar reacting with proteins on high temperatures. So when we do cooking, we almost all experience Maillard reactions almost every day if you love to cook. But for oak, the heating part and especially the breakdown into sugar part may cause some Maillard reactions, but it needs proteins, right? Where did the protein come from? Is wine. So you have the sugar and heating part in oak, but then you need wine, protein, if there's any left in it, to interact with the oak. So I would say for oak reactions, it's more of a how to say combination of different sources, whereas we do see the real Maillard reaction happen in one type of wine, which is traditional method sparkling, especially champagne. If you think about it, champagne usually, of course, nowadays some people do not add sugar at all, but usually they add a tiny bit of dosage, the sugar, right? And then you also have the proteins, amino acids released from the long lease aging autolysis process. So those with long term, without heating, there's no heating in champagne, but just long term aging in that bottle, you could have more and more Maillard reactions. So that is an interesting point to me as well, because lots of people, because of our preconceptions, think, oh, champagne is so wonderful because of all the bubbles. But you know what? To me, it's not only because of the bubbles. Champagne is so fascinating because it's also a drink that contains more umami taste and all this kind of complexity from the Maillard reactions. And that's actually making me feeling champagne or all traditional method sparkling wines are fascinating to drink.
Yeah, so the Maillard, like, does it have a certain taste? It's the sugar and the proteins combining. When they combine it, you're just getting that umami, savory deliciousness. That's the reaction.
Yeah, the only predictable part is that it will become more complex. But Maillard reaction is just a reaction. After the reaction, we will have thousands or even millions of different compounds created from that reaction. So it's kind of unpredictable in terms of specific taste or smell, but it's definitely becoming more complex. And again, that's why we cook. Otherwise, we would just eat certain things raw.
Yeah. And for those who are listening, Maillard, is it Maillard? Maillard?
Yes,
Maillard. Okay,
Maillard.
not pronouncing the L like I did at first. Okay, cool. My goodness, the time has flown, and I've gotten maybe halfway through all the questions here, Gus, as I thought. Your book
No
is
worries.
amazing. Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you'd like to mention? Any areas specifically that you wanted to highlight?
Yeah, I think we touch a lot of things. Even just half of the questions were probably like we talk about many other interesting things in daily life. So I want to emphasize on the fact that after reading the book, first, again, chemistry is fun. I hope it's easy for you to understand the chemistry part of the book. And I try to relate all these kind of examples into our daily life. So it should be pretty straightforward, but if not, I will welcome feedback. But the other very important thing is that we are different from each other. We live in our own sensory world, whether it's because of genetics or it's because how we brought up or how even just at the moment how the surrounding environment influence our taste. So pay attention to your own sense of smell, sense of taste. Pay attention to what you see from your own eye, but also appreciate the fact that other people may likely smell, taste, and see things and hear things differently from your perspective.
I love that. That's a recipe for human understanding and world peace. I think they're right in that wine glass.
And enjoy the most important thing, enjoy your own sensory world.
Absolutely. So the book is Behind the Glass. Gus, this is fabulous. Where can we find you and the book online?
To me, just find me on gusju.com, very straightforward, my name.com. But more importantly, I think the website linked to the official website of the publisher's website, Academy du Vin Library, and it has my book, and you can order on it or order on some other platforms like Amazon. I think the e-version, Kindle version will be available soon. Back to Academy du Vin, I feel very lucky to work with the publisher by chance, and because it's a legacy of the great Steven Spurrier. So I'm now in Napa, and Napa, California wine industry basically got its fame because of him. So I feel really lucky to contribute to a little tiny piece to the library that he founded.
Absolutely. It's quite a tribute. Steven Spurrier, UK-based wine writer, very elegant. He hosted the 1976 Judgment of Paris, where California bested the best of France in a blind tasting by French judges, wine judges. So he left quite a legacy, including the Académie du Vin, which is a collection of the world's best wine books on different regions and aspects of wine. And we'll put a link to Académie du Vin and where people can find you online, Gus, in the show notes. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us here today. That conversation was fascinating, and
thank you.
We'll
There's so many more we can talk about.
I know.
I should go to Canada or come to Napa. We'll have a drink and have not a drink, several
bottle.
drinks to talk things through.
Absolutely. This is fantastic. So I'll say goodbye for now. Thank you so much, Gus.
Thank you, Natalie. Cheers.
Cheers. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our chat with Gus. Here are my takeaways. Number 1, why do certain musty or animalistic aromas like barnyard or manure become more acceptable to wine lovers over time? Gus says that certain smells, especially in some natural wines, are popular today, even though he doesn't like them personally, especially barnyard. I don't really either. He believes that the wine industry, and even the media, are trying to promote a certain style of wines and make people believe that lots of folks love the smell and taste. Open to debate. Number 2, what does minerality really mean when it comes to wine? Gus observes that acidity and minerality are such vague terms and concepts that people in the wine industry discuss frequently. When people say minerality, they could be referring to many different things, from acidity to saltiness to the taste of flint or wet stone. The term is so difficult to translate. His sensory professor noted, and I love this, that whenever people don't know how to describe certain tastes or textural feelings, they use the term minerality. It's like the emperor has no clothes. Number 3, why is mouthfeel so important to appreciating wine? Gus explains that mouthfeel adds several other dimensions to taste, which makes wine tasting even more interesting. Agree fully. When blind tasting, many people depend on smell alone, but he encourages them to pay attention to the textural, tactile sensations from wine as well. And number 4, how does the color of wine influence our perception of how it tastes? Gus says that people usually look at the color first because it's straightforward, even though we see color a bit differently from each other. We are visual animals living in a visual culture, so we have preconceptions and biases based on this. Even though we want to be objective, we really can't. We can be even more biased when we see things first, before smelling them. For example, there are already studies that show if you see the color of a white wine that's presented as a red color because they've added some food dye or something like that, and you ask people to smell it, they will come up with descriptors that are related to red wines rather than so-called white wine descriptors. All right, in the show notes, you'll find a full transcript of my conversation with Gus, links to his website and book, the video versions of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live, and where you can order my book online now. No matter where you live, I will find you, and so will my book. If you missed episode 206, go back and take a listen. I chat about minerality in wine, great hybrid grapes, and what Jimi Hendrix can teach winemakers with Alex Zekovic. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite.
Minerality definitely impacts the flavor, but I think it also impacts the texture. And this wine, to me, although it has a lot of flavor, it's mostly about texture. It doesn't have tannins, but it has this grip that I think comes from minerality and also the high acid. You feel it, caresses your palate. And then because of the acidity, you get this like mouth-watering sensation right after you swallow. And the wine just lasts. You can really taste it for like minutes.
You won't want to miss next week when we chat with Tony Edwards, author of The Very Good News About Wine, which focuses on the surprising health benefits and risks of wine. You're going to be happy about this conversation because there's been a lot of scary headlines, and we're going to pick through all of them, including many that are based on junk science. If you like this episode or learned even one thing from it, please email or tell one friend about the podcast this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in learning how to improve their ability to taste wine and food and to identify aromas and flavors, or just to say, wine has a lot of minerality if you give up. It's easy to find my podcast. Just tell them to search for Natalie MacLean Wine on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, their favorite podcast app, or they can listen to the show on my website at nataliemaclean.com/podcast. Email me if you have a sip, tip, question, or have read my book or are listening to it at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. In the show notes, you'll find a link to take a free online food and wine pairing class with me called The 5 Food and Wine Pairing Mistakes That Can Ruin Your Dinner and How to Fix Them Forever at nataliemaclean.com/class. And that is all in the show notes at nataliemaclean.com/308. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week, perhaps a wine that makes you feel all tingly all over because of its minerality, or its acidity, or its saltiness, or whatever the heck you want to call it. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So, subscribe for free now at nataliemaclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.